Through many of my reflections on the Psalms, I've tried to show how the Psalms are connected as a single literary unit. They are not just simply a random collection of pieces of poetry that are put together with no rhyme or reason or particular order. In Psalm 135, there is a reflection on God's moving his people Israel to the promised land that he gave them. And so it is somewhat of a short historical lesson, which is interesting because it follows Psalms 120 through 134, which depicts somewhat of a journey. And as we move beyond Psalm 135, Psalm 136 is a response to Psalm 135 in several aspects because many of the statements that it makes reflect directly back to Psalm 135. So Psalm 136 is a statement of thanks and praise because of God's enduring love, as he has shown that enduring, faithful, covenantal love, as expressed in Psalm 135. And then the Psalms move to Psalm 137. It is a corporate reflection. The psalm does not name a particular individual, so we do not know whether it was David himself who penned the psalm or someone who tried to pen it in his behalf or from his own perspective, but it is spoken as if it is a group response, and together the people are reflecting, probably after the exile and then the return to the promised land, but it is also possible that it was even penned during the exile. It's not particularly crucial to understanding this psalm in Psalm 137 because the people are simply reflecting about their sadness of being removed from the promised land and their anticipation of one day being able to return. And I pointed out in Psalm 137 that what's particularly striking is the conclusion of Psalm 137, where it just does not seem to fit. And yet, so this is another indicator that these Psalms are not just random reflections that we all can pray at any time and any place, but they speak the voice of Jesus Christ, the Messiah himself, at least in anticipation. Moving on from Psalm 137, Psalm 138 then picks up and it notes that the speaker is David, and it is an expression of praise. You can see that, hopefully, right at the very beginning, and that expression of praise carries through the end of the psalm. But then David reflects upon how the kings hopefully will one day bow to the Lord, and interestingly, how the Lord looks on the lowly, and David considers himself, even in such reflection, as one of those lowly people. In Psalm 139, I don't know how well I did in sharing my expressions or reflections about this psalm. I suspect not very well, but I tried to point out briefly that it's easy to look at this psalm universally as if it applies to everyone at every place at all times who know Jesus Christ. But before we get there, what I tried to show is that really this is the voice of King David himself. And so it is a very personal, intimate psalm in which David acknowledges God's complete and total and detailed and intimate awareness of who he is and how God is active in every aspect of his life. And so this psalm, speaking of the voice of David, uh, doesn't so quickly come to us individually as it expresses the voice, the perceptions of Jesus Christ, the Messiah himself. David is putting himself, I suggested, in that position, wondering and anticipating what this king, this future king, will have to face one day, and how this future king is intimately known by God, who has chosen this person from David's perspective to arise out of his line. And so it is only through this reflection of the king that we ourselves can join in this reflection in Psalm 139. It is because God knows intimately the king, that because we, believers in Jesus Christ, who have put our faith in the King Jesus, can also express such intimate knowledge and awareness of how God knows every aspect of our lives. I suggested recently that Psalms 140 through 143 are desperate cries of deliverance. In Psalm 140, that is very clear. And then in Psalm 141, it is very clear as David calls to the Lord and asks for a quick response. And David, in that process, wants God to discipline him as necessary and to be sure that whatever judgment comes down, he does so righteously. David tries to understand God's righteousness, realizing that his perspective is limited, and that it is not only him who can really pray this, but the Messiah anticipated to come, who can pray this prayer. Moving on to Psalm 142, which is the present psalm to reflect on. And so in Psalm 142, David is just as desperate as he expresses himself in Psalms 140 and 141. David cries aloud to the Lord for help, and he tells the Lord that he is completely emotionally and physically exhausted, spent. He asks for the Lord quick deliverance, quick intervention. He cries out to him as his refuge. So many ideas in Psalm 142 build upon so many other expressions of praise and intercession and worship and thanksgiving that are expressed throughout the entire book of Psalms. Psalm 142 fits into this flow of Psalms 140 through 143, in which David seems to be fighting perhaps the last battles, or in which the battles seem to be culminating to such a great extent that he is completely and totally reliant upon God for his rescue, his salvation, his deliverance. The Psalms depict so much a story, just like all of the books of the Old Testament and even the New Testament together. They depict a grand story of of God's reach out, reach down to the world to provide salvation, to show people that they can trust in him, that they can find eternal life in him and walk with him forever. Psalm 142, like the rest of the Psalms, anticipates and looks forward to the reign of the King, Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And so in this psalm, ultimately, we hear Jesus' voice crying out as in the last days of his life, he faced death and knew the prospect that death could overwhelm him emotionally and in other ways if he would allow it, because he knew that he would be taking upon the sins of the world. And so Psalm 142 is an amazing psalm. We can pray this psalm because Jesus Christ himself voiced these words, whether specifically in spoken words or in perspective or in attitude. Remember, the Psalms are songs that Jesus himself grew up learning and listening and memorizing himself. And so in each and every psalm, I continue to suggest that we need to ask, what would this psalm mean as Jesus prayed and sang and reflected and relearned from the psalm? What an amazing book the Psalms are. They continue to encourage us to pray to God in marvelous ways, to pour out our hearts, to trust in him, to call out to him as our refuge. As Psalm 1 says itself, blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Jesus Christ is that one, and in him we can find our blessings, praying the same psalms that he prayed.